Please welcome Mayor of Ontario, Paul Leon.
Welcome to the 2012 State of the City. Tonight, the City Council will show you how Ontario's past provides the framework for a vibrant and promising future. We're thinking and planning long-term, and our focus is on creating opportunity and building value.
With a time-tested cultural and economic infrastructure, the City of Ontario is still hard at work creating opportunity and building value. Starting in the late 1800s, Ontario built the infrastructure for irrigating the semi-arid land, constructed the first grid lines for electricity and telephone, and established a sophisticated rail and highway system. The city has a legacy of forward-thinking leadership.
Well, I think the distinctions first start with the leadership at the City of Ontario. What they've always done is they've looked at the actual visioning for the City of Ontario, which is far beyond the leadership's term. They've always looked at it as embracing the entrepreneurial spirit, and they've really looked at it as an organization of business and opportunity.
The City of Ontario's leadership role is key right now because they're really at the point where we can be working on some of the softer issues to get ourselves ready for the market when it returns.
Every level of the city has always been tremendously cooperative in helping us do the things that can grow our business. It's helped us to attract retailers, it's helped us to improve the infrastructure, and everything that we've been able to accomplish here we could not have accomplished without the partnership of the City of Ontario.
We're not a lot different than the Chafee brothers that designed the community and the success of all of our businesses since. It was designed to be successful in the way the community is laid out, the location of the community, its access to travel, to be able to ship the commodities and goods.
In the early 1900s, companies moved to Ontario for a competitive advantage. Ontario had the basic elements for business success. Abundant running water created the opportunity for hydropower electricity. With plentiful natural resources, a strategic geographic location, and a visionary group of civic leaders, Ontario became a nucleus for business and commerce. Companies are still looking for a competitive advantage, and Ontario is still the best place to find it.
Companies that Hillwood tries to bring to the region are all looking for an advantage, a competitive advantage. Here in the City of Ontario with the Ontario International Airport and the UPS hub that goes with it, businesses are always trying to get as close to those two features as they can. And the economic indicators that we look at are the absorption rate of industrial buildings. Just 18 short months ago, there were 22 buildings in Ontario and the surrounding markets that were vacant over 500,000 square feet. And today, there are no buildings available, so we have to build.
Job creation in the New Model Colony is going to be fantastic. 8,000 acres, 42,000 residents plus or minus. Every residency is 3 to 7 jobs, huge job growth. There is no other piece of property in Southern California that could generate as many jobs as the New Model Colony can moving forward.
And we want to provide jobs and entertainment for everyone who comes here. We want to retain the businesses we have, and we want to bring new businesses to provide opportunities for everyone.
Transportation and logistics have been a major focus since the 1870s, when the first railroad made its way through what would soon become Ontario. With advancements in technology and a vision for the future, it wasn't long before businesses in Ontario, such as Sunkist, Graber Olives, and GE, were transporting products all over the world.
We've got access to the ports, we've got access to major freeways, and we've got access to railheads. The City of Ontario puts us right smack in the middle of that, and it really is what we do in our business.
World War I helped to create an air-minded generation, giving rise to the power of aviation and promoting airports as a key public asset. After World War II, most of the city's post-war optimism centered around the airport as it transformed to become the Ontario International Airport. Dedicating the airport, Mayor Roy D. Bowles said, "I predict if we take advantage of our opportunity, this port will become one of the largest of its kind on the West Coast."
The airport obviously is a huge economic generator, perhaps the biggest economic generator for the region, responsible for the employment of tens of thousands of folks in the region, and certainly responsible for bringing both cargo and passengers through the city of Ontario.
We're partnering with the 5 different school districts, and currently the Ontario Montclair School District is going through the growing pains of putting together the Promise Scholar program, and we're going to be offering every child who lives in Ontario a chance for a college education.
Since 1883, when the cornerstone was laid for Chaffey College, Ontario has understood the importance of a quality education. Today, Ontario school districts are seeing an improvement in test scores. They're proactively working with local businesses, community colleges, and universities to create programs such as GEMS and Online to College, so that Ontario can continue to produce a large, educated workforce.
There's a wide array of partnerships that our school district has with the private industry. We partner with Kaiser Permanente in developing our counseling center. We have a medical clinic, but more importantly, our district for the first time is creating a 501c3 foundation solely for the unmet needs of our students and our families. And this board that is being created is made up of business leaders and community leaders in the city of Ontario.
120 years after the establishment of the model colony, the City of Ontario is still planning for the future. The Ontario Plan, the new model colony, the revitalization of downtown, and the numerous infrastructure improvements throughout the city will set the course for future generations.
It comes down to this. This city was designed from the beginning by the Chaffey brothers to be the center of everything. This is where the crossroads of trade were. This is where the affordable land was. This is where the water was. This is where the jobs were. This is where you could bring your family and live and thrive and just have the best of everything. It's no different today, and we're going to keep it going in that direction.
As one of the state's leading economic forecasters, Christopher Thornburg is a nationally recognized expert in the study of regional economies, real estate dynamics, labor markets, and business. Please welcome keynote speaker Christopher Thornburg.
Believe it or not, I'm not going to use these teleprompters. But they're kind of cool. I've never actually seen these things in action before. Good evening, everyone. It's great to be here with you this evening. They asked me, of course, to come today, talk a little bit about the economy, and there's a lot to talk about, not a lot of time to talk about it. So I'm going to get right into it. Let's start at the top level first. You may have heard some of this negative rhetoric over the course of the last 6 or 7 months or so. The Republican ranking member of the Senate Banking Committee warned that the European debt crisis could push the United States into yet another big recession. The Economic Cycle Research Institute, a well-respected group out of New York City, not too long ago notified their clients that the U.S. economy is indeed tipping into a new recession. They reaffirmed this position in February this year on Bloomberg TV. Yes, they said the U.S. economy is starting to slow down. Of course, you listen to the political rhetoric. It's all about how either the economy is broken, the recovery is weak because after all, we're in a horribly managed economy, and it's a terrible situation. We have to fix our broken economy. And of course, That kind of rhetoric is not restricted to the right. Not too long ago, Paul Krugman, in one of his columns in the New York Times, said things are not okay, not remotely okay. This is a terrible economy. And of course, on top of everything else, Merrill Lynch came out not too long ago, and they put the chance of QE3 at 75%. A lot of grim talk still. Now, a few years ago, I was the guy who came out and started talking about real estate bubbles, and, I talked about how bad things were going to get, and I'm unfortunately turned out to be mostly right. Well, tonight, I'm very happy to be in front of you, being yet again, shall we say, a bit different than many of my peers, but this time I get to be on the positive side of things. In fact, when you take a look at what's happening in our economy today, all this negative rhetoric adds up to be a hill of beans. Remember that public opinion is a lagging indicator. A lot of the folks who are telling us how bad things are the same folks who in the beginning of 2008 were telling us everything was fine. Here's the reality. The U.S. economy is accelerating, not slowing down. Gains are coming from consumer spending, business investments, and exports. Construction and the credit markets are turning the corner, and they're going to start to become a force for growth over the course of 2012. And guess what? California and the Inland Empire are in the mix. Our economy is keeping up with the rest of the country in terms of the recovery we're in. Things are absolutely getting better. Now, I'm not saying we're completely out of the woods. There's still issues out there. We're still behind by a considerable amount. Typically, when recessions come to an end, the economy grows at an accelerated pace, quickly catching the economy back up to long-run trend lines. It hasn't happened this time. Over the last couple of years, growth has been about average. And the net result of it is there is a big output gap. We still have to worry about Europe to some extent, although I think those worries are overblown. And of course, we have to worry about our own federal government deficit. Oil is an issue too, and trade's kind of an issue too. But most of these challenges, most of these worries are completely overblown in the press. And given the momentum we're seeing in our economy today, there shouldn't be any problem with the U.S. economy simply plowing through these challenges ahead and continuing to grow. And ultimately, we have to keep something in mind. While we do have problems in California, we do have problems in the U.S., I think every day we should wake up and kiss the ground we live on, because this is still the best place on the planet to live. And a lot of times when we're in this sort of spasm of self-pity, we forget about just what a wonderful place it is. And boy, that's here probably more true than anywhere else right here in Southern California. So, thank you. Yeah, I could end right there, but I'm actually going to fill you in on the details. Remember how we got in this mess in the first place? Over the course of the last decade, we had an enormous bubble in the U.S. economy. What I mean by that is we had a massive run-up in asset prices in the U.S. economy. By the way, it wasn't just homes. It was banks and stocks and bonds. It was across the board. It was a big run-up in asset prices that wasn't supported by underlying fundamentals. That is to say, we were making promises to investors that the U.S. economy didn't have the actual output to meet. And of course, it was only a matter of time before asset prices started to sink down to earth, which is what happened in 2007. Now, asset bubbles by themselves don't cause recessions. But what they do is create real changes in the underlying structure of the economy, changes that are just as unsustainable as the asset prices that pushed them there in the first place. These big imbalances, one was the consumer. Consumers took all this wealth to heart, and they said, hey, I'm rich, I'm getting record returns, I don't need to save anymore. And we saw consumer spending as a percent of the economy go to record high levels, even as savings rate went close to 0%. Now, we're told all the time that consumer spending is such an important driver of the U.S. economy. But it turns out there's a bit of a slip there, because even as consumers started to ramp up their spending, the second big imbalance formed in the economy, an imbalance, by the way, that still exists. As Americans began to overspend, so too did the U.S. economy begin to open up a massive trade deficit. We were overspending, and it was the rest of the world that was gaining from that particular spending binge. The third problem, of course, had to do with homes and home construction. Along with everything else that was going on, Americans were assured by the National Association of Realtors that home prices reasonably go up by 15% per year, every year. It will happen forever, and your path to riches is clearly going out and buying a home. The net result of which, of course, people went out and bought homes, and lo and behold, the home building industry was more than happy to produce those units. Over the span of about 4 years, the U.S. economy produced about 3 million too many homes. We vastly overproduced the housing stock, and the net result of that, of course, is the home building industry had to go through a long, low period until we could burn off that excess stock, allow population to catch up to the number of homes that are in the system. And of course, last but not least, we cannot forget about the credit bubble. We hear it all the time about the massive run-up in debt, and it's usually associated with households. But I'm going to show you in just a little bit that it wasn't really a household phenomenon. It is true that America's picked up about $9 billion worth of new debt. Excuse me, wrong number. $9 trillion of new debt over the course of about a 10-year period. But at the same time that all American households picked up $9 trillion in debt, here's a dirty little secret you didn't hear about. The financial sector, the 6% of the economy we call finance, picked up $13 trillion worth of new net. A massive amount of leverage that in the short run boosted profits and boosted bonuses, but ultimately created, shall we say, a massive potential problem in Wall Street, a problem that accumulated up until the failure of Lehman, of course. When Lehman failed, suddenly everybody recognized the danger of all that leverage in the system, and we had a massive credit crisis. So 4 hits to the economy, 4 big hits. And you know, any 2 of these, bad recession. 3 of these, a really bad one. All 4, it had the potential for a catastrophe. But as much as a lot of the things the federal government did was relatively silly, some of the things the Federal Reserve and the federal government did worked. And lo and behold, we came out of this recession over 2.5 years ago. 2.5 years ago, the economy has been growing at a pretty consistent pace ever since then. Now, what happened here in California? We know we got hit worse than most places. We lost more jobs. There was a greater contraction in output. And, of course, the Inland Empire felt it worse, even here, most of the areas right here inside the state of California. Now, we're told quite often that this is because of our business climate. That is to say, it's bad taxes and bad regulations, and businesses are just fleeing the state. And that's why things are so tough. It's a good story. The problem with this good story is it also is completely wrong. Now, by the way, that isn't to say we have a good business climate. I recognize there's lots of issues in California. There's no doubt about it. But when you think about business climate, taxes, and regulations, you have to understand that these are things that have an influence in the growth of an economy, not over the course of a year or two, but over the course of a decade. And up until this recession, turns out California was a success story, not a failure. You give me any particular economic statistic. I'm talking income, employment, manufacturing output, export output. California grew faster than the U.S. overall. There's one statistic on the right-hand side of the screen right there. That's real GDP, and it's an index form going back to 1994. And I got 3 lines. One's for the U.S., one's for California, and one's for that kind of flat, hot place out, you know, a little bit east of us called Texas. Texas, of course, is what we're being constantly compared to. And it turns out, believe it or not, the California economy and the Texas economy grew lockstep. 2 states with 2 different political philosophies, but ultimately 2 states that are economic success stories up until this particular downturn. So why do we get hit so hard? Well, again, it's not business climate. It's because of the exposure of the California economy, the cyclical aspects of this downturn. We had a massive housing bubble, and therefore a big bubble in consumer spending. Texas didn't have a housing bubble, nor did Oklahoma, nor did Louisiana. That entire part of the nation was more or less spared these particular problems. We're a state that produces and ships high-end products from across the globe to across the United States. And at the same time, we produce high-end products for consumers and businesses across the United States and across the globe. Those markets collapsed, and we felt the brunt of that. Texas produces oil. Sounds trite, except for the fact that, yet again, it's true. 15% of the Texas economy is still wrapped up in pulling oil out of the ground and turning it into gasoline. The oil markets have been very steady over the course of the last 7 or 8 years, and that, of course, has provided a lot of relief to the Texas economy. Is there a Texas economic miracle? Absolutely. 200 million years ago, all these dinosaurs decided to die under the great state of Texas. Now, of course, first half of 2011, things started to slow down a lot. Overall growth slowed to about 0.85%, and that's what set off a lot of panic. But you know, what happened in the first half of 2011 really boiled down to 2 things. One, we had to pull back in Iraq, and by the way, that took a little bite out of growth the second half of the year. And of course, 2, was we had all those problems with the auto industry that stemmed in part from the disaster that happened in Japan a little over a year ago today. A lot of those cars weren't available, and the net result of that, of course, is that we saw consumer spending on automobiles go down quite a bit. But you know, by the second half of the year, the economy really did start to pick up some speed. And it was amazing to me that right to the end of the year, even now, you hear people continue to talk about how the U.S. economy is going to go into another downturn. No sign of that. Again, second half of the year, much stronger than the first half. And guess what? That growth has continued into this year. Consumer spending grew very sharply at the end of last year. And while it's been flat over the last few months, you can see on the left-hand side, I would point out that's all because people haven't been spending a lot of money on utilities. Remember, it's been a very warm winter, not just here in California, but across the nation. If you get rid of utilities, turns out consumer spending growing at a very solid 2% annualized pace over the course of the last quarter or so. Consumers are fine. And of course, February was a very good month. You saw auto sales get above 15 million on an annualized basis. Retail sales, getting rid of gas and automobiles, has surged over the last couple months. Consumers are doing fine. But what about that deleveraging? We're told all the time that we're going through a painful period of consumer deleveraging. Again, total nonsense. Yes, Americans are carrying a lot more debt, but I would point out that most of that debt's mortgage debt. And oh, by the way, mortgage debt's cheaper than it's been in 40 years. We don't think about it too much. Seems almost normal. Gee, I can go out and get a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage for 4%. You say, 4%? Geez, I got under 4. You know, I put down a point, got 3.85. Keep something in mind. A decade ago, in 2001, if you got a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage, you know what you would have been paying? Over 8%. Twice the rate you're paying today. Now, what that means, of course, is the financial obligations ratio, which was on the left-hand side of the screen there. That is the percent of household income being used to service current financial obligations. That's dropped to levels we haven't seen since 1992. Americans aren't credit constrained, and boy, you're starting to see those credit markets move forward again. Consumers are fine. Industrial activity has been picking up, growing at about a 5% annualized pace. And capacity utilization, the percent of potential output that we're actually producing, above 75%. What that means, things are getting a little tight out there. When that gets up to 80%, that's considered to be, boy, right at the end. And what that means, of course, is businesses are going to continue to invest. And remember, a lot of the stuff that businesses use to expand capacity is stuff produced right here in California. This is great news for us. Of course, a lot of this has to do with the fact that exports have been booming. Exports produced here in California, produced across the United States. Exports have risen very dramatically since the end of the downturn, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that the dollar's come down so much. You know, relative to about a decade ago, your average American worker is 15% more competitive from a cost basis than they were a decade ago. That dollar coming down is one of the best things that can happen to the U.S. economy because it makes our products more affordable for foreigners to buy, a big source of the recovery we're seeing in the economy today. But of course, there's good signs that this industrial production will continue to grow. You look at durable goods orders through January, growing at a very solid pace. And the ISM surveys, the Institute of Supply Management, very positive both for manufacturing as well as for non-manufacturing parts of the economy. Lots of good signs. As for the housing market, it too is starting to turn the corner. Over the last couple of months, we've seen a decent increase in overall home sales. Sure, still lower than it was in 2004 and 2005, but, you know, some very good numbers relative to the last few years. And even more importantly, on the right-hand side there, that's existing home inventories, the month's supply of homes on the market today. And look how that has absolutely collapsed over the course of the last few months. Fewer and fewer houses are being put on the market, and that means that part of the market's going to start tightening up. Things are starting to turn the corner. And of course, what about prices? You heard all about how prices were sagging at the end of last year, and it is true. They came down just a little bit, at least according to the Case-Shiller Index. But you know, what's interesting about Case-Shiller is they don't distinguish between distressed and non-distressed transactions. And it turns out that's very important. On the right-hand side here, there's another company, actually one based here in Southern California, called CoreLogic. And they do a same sort of index, a home price index, but they divide their sample into all transactions and then all transactions getting rid of distressed, that is to say, getting rid of foreclosures and short sales. It turns out the decline in prices we're seeing is mainly due to growing discounts of foreclosed properties. You look at other parts of the market, turns out things have been nice and stable lately. But what about foreclosures? We keep hearing about this second wave of foreclosures. They're going to hit the market, housing market at any point in time. Yet again, more of this negative rhetoric that doesn't seem to have any foundation whatsoever in truth. Yes, it is true the number of foreclosed properties has stayed stubbornly high over the course of the last couple of years. But that is mainly to do with judicial states like New Jersey and Florida that don't have enough courtrooms to process all the foreclosures. Places like California, we've burned off. 90% of the units have been foreclosed on. They've already been resold to new owners. And even more importantly, the percent of mortgages that are seriously delinquent has been falling very steadily over the course of the last couple of years. Here in California, percent seriously delinquent peaked at about 8.5%. It right now is down to about 5%, falling at a very solid pace. I'm not saying the housing markets are going to turn the corner rapidly, but it's pretty clear the worst carnage is behind us, and from here on out, things are going to get a little better. What's good in the housing market today? Two things. Affordability, fantastic. If you're going to buy a house, I'm telling you, it's a good time to do it. Where interest rates are, where incomes are, prices are fantastic. And just as important, the percent of units not just for sale, but just vacant in general, finally starting to turn the corner. We're finally absorbing that excess supply. And what that means is that construction is going to start kicking again over the course of this particular year. And you're already seeing it in starts and permits starting to move up. On the bad part of the equation, again, there's still some issues out there. One of them, of course, is that Americans are carrying a lot of debt, and what that means is they don't have a lot of equity in their existing structure. Overall equity levels in the U.S. housing market today are the lowest they've ever been. And remember, equity is what people use to buy their next home. It's their new drapes, the new carpet, the down payment. No equity, you're not moving. So that's going to slow things down a bit. Also, of course, we continue to have the movement away from owner-occupied into rental housing. But again, with foreclosures starting to slow down, that process too will start to slow down. Commercial trends nationally also point in the right direction. As a result of that, non-residential construction has been picking up some speed as well, and that is also starting to add to overall growth. And of course, even the lending market. C&I loans, that's one of my favorite indicators of weekly numbers from the Federal Reserve. C&I loans made to companies for small investments. Again, continuing to rise, been rising steadily over the course of the last year. It's one of the reasons I never bought in this idea of a second recession. And even real estate loans have hit bottom and are starting to grow. Lending is becoming easier and easier. The standards are starting to come down. Credit's flowing a little better. All good signs for the economy. And of course, with all that, we have better numbers from the labor market. Over the last 3 months, we've added about over 250,000 private sector jobs in the U.S. economy today over the last 3 months. Good, solid numbers, folks. The economy is picking up speed. Well, how about here in California? Yet again, things are coming to place here as well. Taxable sales up very strongly over the course of the last few quarters. Hotel occupancy rates up across the board. Every market in the state is seeing increased hotel occupancy. More tourists, more business people coming to the state of California. Container traffic has bounced back nicely. Imports not quite as much as exports, but that's the kind of shift we're going to be seeing in the United States economy. We still need to close that trade deficit, and you're going to see more and more of that trend. More exports, fewer imports. From a logistics standpoint, shouldn't make much of a difference. If anything, your exports should be closer to home because a lot more exports from California leave out of the airports rather than going out of the seaports. And of course, exports produced here in California have also really been turning the corner. Up about 10%, 12% on a year-on-year basis. Very solid growths across the board, led by industrial machinery, electric machinery, optics, edible fruits, vehicle parts. Lots of good numbers. California's manufacturing sector really on fire right now. They're doing a lot of good work, selling a lot of products. And of course, you're also seeing it, well, in most airports. Here's one bit of bad news for the Inland Empire. If you look at some of the passenger traffic, look at San Francisco. Year to year, up 11%. Long Beach, 9%. Los Angeles, 5%. Way down there at the bottom, I got to point out, one of the hotter statistics I'm seeing for all the growth happening around here is the fact that Ontario's traffic has actually dropped 7% on a year-on-year basis. And I know this has been an issue for you out here, and it should be. On the right-hand side, excuse me, I have a little index I created. What this is, I call this almost a capacity usage index, or what this is the annual number of passengers that move through a particular airport in 2011 divided by the population of the economy they're in. Of course, top of the list is SFO, San Francisco at 22 rate. We know that's a hub for all of travel in Northern California. Beyond that, Los Angeles at 7, San Diego at 5. Way down there at the bottom, even the regional airports like Oakland and Orange County, Sacramento, you're looking at 4, 3.6, 2.8 capacity utilizations. Way down at the bottom there, Ontario, running at 1. This clearly is an airport that needs a lot more traffic to be going through it. And why it's not, well, that's a policy decision, and I'm not sure what's going on there. But it is clear that Ontario should be a big source of growth, and it hasn't started to play that role yet out in the Inland Empire. As for labor markets here in the state, again, moving forward at a decent basis. We just got some revised numbers, and the good news was they weren't revised down at all. In fact, quite the opposite. Numbers seem to be moving forward at a pretty good basis. And it really is across the board. With the exception of Sacramento, every part of California is seeing big job numbers. San Jose on top, followed by San Francisco. And yes, you saw right, the third number there, the third fastest growing economy, Inland Empire added about 1.6% to its labor payroll force over the course of the last year. Good solid numbers here. And housing in the state, just like in the nation overall, relatively steady. And of course, foreclosures. I've already pointed out, delinquencies are down. You're seeing state foreclosure activity, both notices of defaults and as well as overall trustee deeds have turned the corner and are falling over the course of the last couple of years. From over the last 2 years, there's some numbers on the right-hand side there. You can see, for example, here in Riverside, trustee deeds, that's foreclosures, has dropped 50% over the course of the last 2 years. San Bernardino, same sort of picture, down 45% over the course of the last couple of years. How about here in the Inland Empire specifically? Good solid numbers over the course, particularly driven by the last 6 months. And you can see there about a 1.6% change over the course of the last year, driven by admin support, professional and technical services, non-durable manufacturing up 6.5%, combination 5.8%. Some very solid numbers. Wholesale trade up strongly, healthcare up strongly. Great numbers across the board. Still some weaknesses, still some offsets. Real estate, finance, and of course public employment still showing some negative numbers. But there are other parts of the economy, you can see right there, doing very well. And of course, you look at taxable sales across the area, again, growing strongly here in the Inland Empire, even stronger than in most of the nation overall. So good solid numbers there. And you can see autos up 15%, business and industry spending up 10%, restaurants up 6%, solid numbers. And even here in Ontario actually, well, Ontario has been really one of the centers of recovery in the Inland Empire. And here's just a basic number. Population. You can see how population peaked at about 2005, and since then it's been absolutely flat. With the economic troubles, the troubles in the housing market, you just haven't had a situation where the population's been able to grow. People have been leaving. Over the course of the last 2 years, population growth has come back to the Ontario region. People are now starting to come back. And who can blame them? Growth in Ontario over the course of the last year, we estimate at about 3.8%. Now, of course, a lot of that's driven by healthcare. You can see that number. No, it's not your imagination, up 40%. That, of course, due to the new Kaiser Center opening up, lots of new jobs. But even arts and entertainment, professional business services, information jobs, lots of good signs. You add it up, adds to about a 4% growth in employment right here in Ontario, one of the fastest growing cities in California at this particular point in time. And taxable sales growing at one of the fastest rates here compared to anywhere, up 11.9% over the course of the last year. Very solid numbers indeed. And you see it other places as well. Overall office vacancies in the Inland Empire have been falling. Rents are still soft too, but vacancies for offices are falling, and that's particularly true around the airport, down 1.7% over the course of the last year or so. You look at those retail markets, things have just about topped out. Vacancy rates are not coming down, but they're not rising either. And of course, rents have started to flatten out. But even here, you look at West San Bernardino, you look at that airport area, falling vacancy rates there. You could see the sign of the strength. You could see an economy start to turn the corner. And of course, the industrial markets. You already heard a little bit about that. Now, again, falling numbers there, about steady around the airport, about 7% vacancy rate, but low relative to most of the area. And I'll tell you this right now, there's been some big deals happening here in the Inland Empire. Vacancy rates in industrial property have been dropping faster here than anywhere. This is going to be a very tight market within a year or two. And so it's not too much of a surprise that when you look at non-residential building permits, very solid numbers in 2011 relative to 2010, up about 20% in the Inland Empire overall. Still not back to previous peak, but moving in the right direction. And right here in Ontario, also up about 20% from 2010 to 2011. Good solid signs that things are starting to move forward. How about homes? What's happening with that? Well, even there, you see Ontario moving ahead of the rest of the Inland Empire. Sales and prices flat overall for the Inland Empire. Prices still flat here in Ontario, running, a little less than $200,000. But of course, sales have just now started to pick up, and it shouldn't be a surprise with all that new job growth. Of course, with more sales in the local area, that means those housing markets are going to get a little tighter. I expect some price appreciation over the course of the next year or two. And again, defaults and foreclosures, all trending in the right direction. Things are clearly, the worst is clearly behind us on this particular front. Now, I want to talk about housing just for a minute or two. One of the reasons I want to talk about housing is this. We hear all the time about taxes and regulations as being a big problem for California. And again, I agree we have some issues there. But you know what's funny? If you look at housing in California, according to the 2010 census, California had the second lowest housing vacancy rate in the nation. I heard folks talking at the beginning of this crisis about how the Inland Empire is going to be saddled with huge neighborhoods of empty, dilapidated homes that were going to be this massive problem for the area. It was going to take them a decade to clean up. It hasn't happened. Have you noticed that? That's because there's not enough housing in California. And there hasn't been because we haven't been building enough for years. Which reason I'm bringing this up, of course, is look at apartment markets. Look how vacancy rates in apartments have been falling across the Inland Empire, particularly here in the Ontario area, and rents are starting to rise again. And the reason, of course, this is an issue is even though we don't have enough housing, you really haven't seen a lot of activity on permits. Overall state permits for single family and multifamily, not doing much right now. Now, why is this important? Well, we get compared to Texas a lot. And while taxes, we could talk about it. Regulations, yeah, they have a less regulated environment, but they have a lot worse air quality too. But here's a place that Texas has us beat hands down, housing. The most expensive housing market in Texas, the most expensive, top of the heap, primo housing market in Texas is Austin, Texas, which has a median housing price of, get ready for it, about $195,000. That's the most expensive housing market in Texas. The overall state has a median price of about $100,000. Here in California, of course, the overall state has a median price of about $250,000. San Jose tops the list at about $600,000. Let me point something else out to you. Texas, which of course is a small government state, surprisingly has more public employees as a percent of their workforce than we do. They have more policemen, more firemen, more teachers. How do you get away with that? Well, here's the answer. You pay them 30% less. How do you get away with that? Well, it turns out when the cost of housing is half there, what it is here, you don't have to pay people as much. Think about that for a second. I'm a small businessman in Southern California. I live my office is over by the airport in Century Boulevard. You know, people come to, let's say I find a bright young economist in Memphis, Tennessee, and I go, I want that guy. I reach out to him and I say, I want you to come work for me. What's my sales pitch? I want you to get on a plane and move your family out here to LA where you too can buy a crappy house for $500,000. Not a heck of a sales pitch. The stresses that home prices put on California's economy, we can't tell you enough about because it's an enormous issue. And it's one of the biggest constraints on growth in this economy. Middle-class families kind of live here. Now, mind you, for the Inland Empire, this is one of your greatest sources of strength because the Inland Empire represents the last affordable housing in Southern California. And that's one of the reasons why people are coming out here and buying these homes. They're great deals, and people are going to continue to move here. And that's one of the greatest strengths for Inland Empire. You know, there's not going to be any this decade long. Everybody goes back to 1990 when it took the Inland Empire forever to recover. That's not this kind of downturn. Yes, you got hit very hard. But ultimately, California, the fundamentals of the California economy are strong. The economy is moving forward again. People are going to be coming here. Jobs are coming back again, and they're going to be looking for homes. You know where they're going to come? They're going to come to the Inland Empire. So you've got a growing industrial base, you've got a growing logistics base, and yes, people are coming back too. A lot of good things happening out here. Now, what are some of the big worries about the economy today? Well, Europe, of course, has been on a lot of people's minds, although things have quieted down. We have our own federal deficit. There's inflation. There's China and trade. And, of course, some oil. Let's bang through a few of these. I'm going to talk about Europe first. A lot of people were freaking out about Europe, and they're still worried about it. Of course, Greece is in the midst of going through a regulated default. And people were wondering about Italy and wondering about Spain. Well, I want to point something out. Europe, like the United States, has a problem. And that is their governments are spending more than they're taking in terms of tax revenues. And the problem with doing that for too long is there comes a point in time where those bond markets suddenly become worried that you're not going to pay them back. In the case of Greece, they got worried a little too late. But that doesn't necessarily imply you're going to have a short-run crisis. Short-run crisis is going to cause a breakup of the euro, a short-run crisis that's going to cause massive economic disruptions in their banking system and necessarily, of course, in ours because our economies are so closely tied together, particularly in the financial front. The reason it doesn't, that long-run crisis doesn't have to turn into a short-run crisis is because of the fact that we have something called a central bank. We call it the Federal Reserve, they call it the European Central Bank. And we always think about central banks as being forces for price stability and economic stability. But it turns out that wasn't their original job. The original job of a central bank was to be there as the lender of last resort. Remember, banking systems have a problem. They borrow short and they lend long. But then the result of that, of course, is that they become exposed to what we call runs. When all their short-run depositors suddenly say, I'm scared you're going to collapse, I want my money back, they can't unwind their long-run positions fast enough, and bam, you have a massive financial crisis. The point of a central bank is to be the lender of last resort, to step up, place the money into the system until the panic calms down, and then, of course, depositors come back and you can take your money back. We think about quantitative easing. We think about TARP. We think about the federal stimulus program. That's chump change. The biggest thing that happened over the course of this crisis was when the Federal Reserve opened up that lending window and lent out $11 trillion of funding to banks, both here in the United States and across the globe, to calm down the crisis, to prevent a massive banking system failure. And you know what? The European Central Bank can and has done the same thing. So that part of the crisis is over. Yes, they still have to deal with long-run deficits. And yes, there's going to be ups and downs. But for the most part, they've settled this issue with the banks. They've opened up a comfortable lending window. And you're going to see that story start to go to the back page of the paper. And, of course, in the short run, what does it mean for the U.S.? Well, in the short run, every time something bad happens over here, we get a good and a bad effect. The good effect is our interest rates go down, and that makes it nicer to borrow. The bad effect is it makes the U.S. dollar go up, and that makes our exports less competitive. As things start to calm down over the course of this year, you can expect two things to happen here in the United States. Interest rates will start to drift up, and the dollar will start to drift down again. We're already starting to see that process, and that'll again pick up that export surge we saw in the middle part of last year and hopefully carry it right into 2013. And, of course, speaking about governments, here's my favorite cartoon from last year. I don't typically use cartoons, but I love this one so much. The big worry out there, can the U.S. economy survive a double dip? Much better question, can the U.S. economy survive 535 dips? Come on. We also, of course, have a massive federal deficit problem. Our deficit's running close to 10% of GDP. And mind you, I don't approve of this deficit, and I'll tell you why. Most of this deficit has gone to giving tax cuts to American consumers, which sounds nice on paper, except for the vast majority of that tax cut hasn't gone to supporting American production. You give folks a few extra bucks in their paycheck, they go out and they buy a gadget that's probably assembled in China. So in other words, our government's borrowing hundreds of billions of dollars, and most of the value, the fiscal value of that money, is going to China in the form of increased demand, U.S. demand for Chinese products. It's not helping us, it's helping them. And that's the wrong way you want to do it. I would have been much better off had they skipped the tax cuts altogether, borrowed that money, and build infrastructure. Wouldn't it have been nice to have a few extra roads flowing through Southern California, getting some of these schools cleaned up? That would have been much better use of that money. But be that as it may, the big issue here is, does it mean crisis is coming down on us at a very rapid pace? And the answer is no. Look, debt levels in the U.S. economy are about 70% of GDP on a net basis. That's not very high for developed countries. And even at the pace we're going, in 3 years it'll be about 80%, which is still relatively low. Again, I don't approve of it, but at the same time you've got to recognize you can't go cold turkey on these things. My biggest worry is not so much that we can't do this, but that we can't get a government together that will come up with a reasonable way of now pulling ourselves out of it in a reasonable way. That is to say, with yes, cuts in spending, but yes, increases in taxes at the same time. We're going to use a combination of the two to wean us off this particular problem. And it is a problem. It remains to be seen how they're going to deal with it. And of course, at the local level, we also have to worry about the fact, not so much that our revenues aren't growing, in fact they are in Sacramento and the local governments, but we have to worry about the fact that approximately 25% of state and local spending comes from the federal government. If they start pulling back dramatically on spending, you're going to feel it here in the Inland Empire, no doubt about it. Last but not least, got to talk a little bit about oil. when oil prices are up. Oil prices run a little above $100 a barrel at this particular point in time. And yet again, a lot of folks are getting worried about that. They say, oh, well, the Inland Empire can't recover now for sure because no one can afford to commute from the Inland Empire to those jobs that are on the coast. Well, I would argue two things. First of all, there's more jobs coming back to the Inland Empire, so not as many people may need to commute. But even more importantly, look, get out there in the 60, get out there in the 10, get out there on the 91 freeway. And what do you see? You see BMWs. You see SUVs. You see pickup trucks. Look, folks, this is not the 1970s. Today, we have choices. We can hang up the pickup truck and go out and buy a Prius. And people are already starting to do that. We have the ability to avoid the consumption of oil when those prices go up if we choose to do that. So it may have a transitory effect, but until oil prices hit $140, $150 a barrel, it's not an issue for the U.S. economy. We're perfectly fine. And of course, last but not least, what about inflation? What about all that money the Federal Reserve pumped into the economy? Buy gold. You'll hear some of these guys say, well, look, the Federal Reserve put $1.8 trillion of raw money into the money supply, which is very scary until you realize that $1.6 trillion of that is still sitting in the bank in the form of excess reserves. Money supply is not growing. Inflation is not an immediate risk. We got a lot of space before inflation kicks in. We got a lot of time to withdraw all those excess reserves. So we're not in an inflationary environment yet. Now, in a year or two, we'll see. But right now, not an issue. And of course, our forecast, you add it all up, is pretty bullish. Growth above 3% most of this year. A little slower in the first quarter. We're picking up towards the end of the year. A bit of a bump next year, we think, because taxes are going to come up pretty sharply. But ultimately, we find ourselves pleasantly on the bullish side. And by the way, I'm pretty comfortable with this particular forecast. A lot of good things are happening, folks. Growth is picking up. We have, obviously, the housing market turning the corner. Commercial real estate turning the corner. You see good job growth and income starting to rise. You have exports that continue to tick along. The consumer's fine. The economy is truly moving forward. Now, things are still out. There's still worries. You've got to watch trade issues. You've got to watch those public deficits. But again, I'm hopeful that the momentum we're picking up now will carry us over that. And California, far from being an economic wreck, is right there in the mix. Our state is recovering. And of course, what we're doing in California is we're shifting from an internal to an external sources of demand. It's not consumer spending driven by a housing bubble, but this time it's exports and business spending that's driving the industrial part of our economy. It's logistics of moving those products around. And of course, this is very good news for the Inland Empire. I have high hopes for this part of the world. Growth in Southern California, when it occurs, is going to come right back here. Up until this downturn, the Inland Empire was one of the fastest growing economies in the nation. And you know what's going to happen over the next couple of years? It's yet again going to be one of the fastest growing economies in the nation. And you here in Ontario, sitting where you are, in terms of the highways around you, given the airport right in the middle of the mix, you're the center of it. So it's going to be a really good couple of years. We still have challenges. At the state level, we know that. We got pension reform, we got revenue reform, we got expenditure reform. We got to worry about housing, we got to worry about infrastructure. But you know, ultimately, we're not doing all that because we want to keep up with Texas. I couldn't care less about Texas. I care about California. 20 years ago, I moved here from upstate New York, and I tell you right now, I'm not going back. So it's going to be a good 2012 and a better 2013. You live in the best place on the planet and prosper. Thank you very much, everybody. I appreciate it.
Good job, Chris. Thank you. How many of you knew you were going to sit through about 40 minutes of statistics and eat it up like a Denny's Grand Slam breakfast? I'm telling you. That's great stuff. So I'd like to just thank you, Dr. Thornburg, for your presentation. But also for highlighting the many local economic opportunities for our business community, didn't he? Great job. Well, continuing with our commitment to building the local economy and creating jobs, we, that is the Ontario City Council, launched the Set Ontario Free campaign to demand that Los Angeles officials return the Ontario airport to local control. And no is not an option. We brought the campaign to the big leagues. So let's play ball.
Hi everybody, I'm Tommy Lasour, and I firmly believe, without a doubt, Ontario International Airport should be under local control and not managed from a distant city. You know, in baseball, I led that team right from the dugout, not from outside the stadium. In every career, it's important to recognize the moment of truth. As a manager, I knew it was up to me to make the right decision. My moment of truth, knowing it will change the outcome. I believe whatever business you're in, whether it's in baseball or the airport business, you have to know when to make the big change. In order to get the best results, it takes a team working together for the same big picture, winning the game. Right now, it's one of those moments of truth for the Ontario Airport. Gaining local control will restore Ontario Airport as the #1 economic engine for the Inland Empire. We will get the flights, service, and convenience we need to live, work, and play in Southern California. Come on, LA, let's set Ontario free.